Welcome to this explainer. Let's just jump right in today because we are going to decode the psychological machinery behind emotionally unavailable partners. If you've ever been in a relationship dynamic that felt, I don't know, incredibly rigid, intensely lonely, or just deeply confusing, you might have actually been dealing with some very specific hidden psychological traits. So we're going to unpack exactly what those traits are, how they work, and really understand why these relationships can feel so profoundly hurtful. Here is our quick roadmap for today. We're going to cover, first, the world of no emotions. Second, rigid perfectionism and Anankastia. Third, narcissism and what happens when these traits collide. Fourth, why these relationships hurt so much. And finally, the childhood survival strategy. All right, part one, the world of no emotions. To truly understand the absolute emptiness in these specific types of toxic relationships, we first have to explore this complete void of feeling. Clinically, this is known as Alexithymia. Basically, it's the inability to recognize, interpret, label, and express emotions in yourself and in other people. Based on the clinical analysis of Professor Sam Vakkanen, people suffering from alexithymia endure this severe kind of emotional blindness. Just imagine, for a second, looking at a color but having absolutely no concept of what that color is or even how to describe it. That is exactly what emotions are to someone with this trait. Feelings are just completely rejected, ignored, or repressed. And here's the kicker. They aren't just hiding their emotions from you. They fundamentally cannot identify or process them at all. As Professor Vakkanen points out, many alexithymic people actually compare themselves to machinery or to robots. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates their internal landscape. They function through cold, calculated structural logic rather than, normal human warmth. Because they are so utterly detached from their own bodies and their inner emotional worlds, they perceive themselves, and frankly, they operate like automatons. They view life as just a series of tasks to execute rather than a shared human experience. Moving right along to part two, rigid perfectionism and Anankastia. So if emotional blindness is the void, Anankastia is the punishing shield they use to aggressively control the outside world. It's a trait domain characterized by rule-based, extreme perfectionism, extreme emotional and behavioral constraint, and this hyper-narrow focus on controlling behavior. It's essentially this relentless, exhausting pursuit of a flawless reality. An individual with this trait sets up incredibly rigid, impossible standards. And you might be wondering why? Well, it's because they are constantly fighting off an internal sense of catastrophe. They literally feel that if they don't control every tiny detail, the whole shebang will fall apart. So they enforce these wild constraints on everyone around them just to manage their own internal chaos. Now, it is absolutely crucial to distinguish Anankastia from simply being, a highly organized person or a neat freak. While Anankastia might vaguely look like high conscientiousness on the surface, comparing the two shows just how superficial that really is. Conscientiousness is pro-social, right? It helps society, it stems from a healthy motivation, and it's adaptable. Anankastia, on the other hand, is rigid, it's punitive, self-oriented, and totally driven by an impending sense of catastrophe. It acts as a passive-aggressive weapon. Because the standards are so impossibly rigid, it pretty much guarantees that everyone around them is going to constantly fail. It's basically externalized aggression completely disguised as having high standards. That brings us to part three, narcissism, and what happens when these traits collide. So, what actually happens when the robotic emptiness of alexithymia meets the punishing demands of Anankastia? Well, Professor Vakkanen proposes that pathological narcissism is essentially the merger of these two specific traits. It's like a giant destructive puzzle coming together. When you combine the absolute rejection of emotions, which they view as weak or imperfect, with a rigid demand for perfection to control the world, the result is someone who lacks empathy entirely. They reject positive emotions like love and intimacy because those require vulnerability, and vulnerability is a dangerous weakness to them. But they heavily rely on negative affectivity, things like anger, hatred, and envy, because those feelings are highly destructive yet incredibly effective for forcefully controlling their environment and getting what they want. And this perfectly explains the central paradox of the narcissist. They hold this deep belief that emotions render us imperfect, and therefore to be perfect, one must suppress or eliminate human emotion entirely. They literally view normal human emotions as a dangerous malfunction, like a bug in their software that ruins their rigid perfectionism.
True emotional intelligence, or what we'd call psychological mindedness, the ability to self-reflect and understand nuance, is just completely absent. To them, to feel is to be flawed.
Which leads us to part 4, why these relationships hurt. With those clinical foundations in place, we can now see precisely why attempting to build a romantic bond with someone harboring these traits is sadly doomed to fail. Because emotions are the absolute pivot point of all human connection. A partner with Alexithymia and Anankastia can only offer what's called a flat attachment. It results in very superficial bonds. They lack the emotional data to even differentiate themselves from you. You aren't a separate, complex human being to them. You're basically an internal object, a prop functioning within their rigid, robotic script in their mind. This total lack of empathy and relational affection leads to massive dissatisfaction and profound pain for the partner. And if you dare to step out of that script, you are punished for it. As the research notes, the interpersonal relationships with people with alexithymia are painful to the partner, very hurtful, and very chaotic. The fallout is this deeply arid, infertile relationship soil. Intimacy can literally never grow here. Studies show that this dynamic leaves the partner completely starved of empathy, entirely misunderstood, and subjected to constant passive-aggressive disappointment. The pain isn't just a byproduct. It's practically baked into the very structure of the relationship. Finally, let's look at part 5, the childhood survival strategy. We really have to ask the deeper question here. How does a human being become this mechanical and detached in the first place, right? Nobody's just born a robot. According to psychoanalysts like Joyce McDougall, all infants actually start out naturally alexithymic. They can't speak or process emotions yet. Normally, a loving parent helps them learn to feel. But if in early childhood a child is exposed to severe trauma, abuse, or a capricious, rejecting mother, they quickly learn a very dark lesson. Experiencing emotions only brings pain and abandonment. So in later childhood, they reject all emotions just to survive that pain, resulting in permanently arrested emotional development. Fast forward to adulthood, and the individual uses rigid perfectionism, Anankastia, to safely navigate a reality that they simply refuse to feel. And the data backs this up in a startling way. Over 40% of people with post-traumatic stress disorder are also diagnosed with alexithymia. That's huge. The post-traumatic nature of this emotional blindness is absolutely staggering. It really highlights that the narcissist's absolute rejection of feelings isn't just pure malice, it is fundamentally a defense mechanism. It was built brick by brick to fend off the overwhelming terror of their early childhood environment. Psychoanalyst Joyce McDougall calls this process disaffectation. She notes that they pulverize, eject, and reject all emotional representations from consciousness to repress emotions, to pretend that they don't exist. To avoid being completely shattered by the very people who are meant to protect them, the child decides to sever their connection to their own humanity. They pulverize and eject their feelings, just pretending they don't exist at all. It's this ultimate brilliant act of self-preservation that tragically locks them in a lifetime of total isolation. So, if emotions are the absolute foundation of humanity, can a relationship ever survive without them? As we wrap up this explainer, we are left with this pretty haunting realization about the mechanical nature of these personality traits. It really challenges us to reflect on the absolute necessity of emotional vulnerability. Without the ability to feel, to be imperfect, and to share that imperfection with someone else, true human connection is just impossible. Thank you so much for joining me to decode this incredibly complex topic. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.